I was 19 when I inherited the house at Osprey Hill. It came from an aunt I barely remembered, my mother's half-sister, Elena, who lived alone for most of her life in a town so far north it barely registered on maps. She died quietly, without children or spouse, and I suppose the house had nowhere else to go. I didn't expect to visit, let alone stay, but something about the letter that arrived, thick, cream-colored paper, handwritten in a delicate, shaky script, lingered in my mind like the scent of old books or the hush of snowfall. "Come see the place," it said. "You may not remember it, but it remembers you." That's how they worded it. And something about that phrasing, oddly intimate and a little unsettling, hooked itself deep. The drive up took most of a day. The road narrowed as the forest thickened, growing more ancient and unfamiliar the farther I went. Tall trees leaned over the highway like they'd been watching it for centuries. By the time I reached the property, winding up a gravel path framed by birch and fir, the light was beginning to fade, and the house stood waiting in the hollow like it had always known I'd return. It was older than I expected. A steep roof line, with siding weathered silver gray, shuttered windows like half-closed eyes. It didn't look abandoned, just paused, as though it had been holding its breath. The key was still under the stone frog by the porch, just like the letter said. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke. Dust motes swirled in the light that spilled through tall windows. The furniture was all still there, arranged neatly, as if Aunt Elena had simply stepped out for a moment and never come back. A rocking chair by the fireplace. A brass-framed bed with handmade quilts. A kitchen lined with glass jars, each labeled in the same careful hand. Thyme, mullein, lamb's ear. I stayed, that first night, in one of the smaller rooms upstairs. It had twin beds and a low, slanted ceiling. I left the door open. The house made sounds like an old body, groans in the floorboards, sighs in the walls. But it didn't feel threatening. Not exactly. Just aware. I thought I heard a voice once, soft and low, calling my name from somewhere below. But when I leaned over the railing and looked down into the dark hallway, nothing moved. I told myself it was the wind, that I was just tired from the drive. But sleep didn't come easy that night. It felt like something in the house was waiting for me to fall asleep before it began to move. Not malicious, not dangerous, just curious, like it remembered me better than I remembered it. I woke early, long before the sun had fully risen. The house was hushed in a strange way, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something holding its breath. The light that seeped through the curtains was gray and reluctant, and I felt as though I'd only dreamed of sleeping. Downstairs, the kitchen greeted me with warmth that shouldn't have been there. I hadn't turned on the stove, hadn't lit a fire, but the air had that faint dry heat of something freshly extinguished. The kettle on the counter was warm to the touch. For a moment, I thought I saw steam. I told myself it was residual heat. Maybe the house, after all these years, retained things, temperature, smells, memory. Maybe it was settling around me, welcoming me back. Outside, the yard was overgrown but not wild. The garden had not been touched in years, but it hadn't collapsed into chaos. The hedges were lopsided but still held their shape. Paths through the grass suggested careful footsteps, someone walking the same routes again and again, long after they were needed. In the far corner of the garden was a glass house. It looked fragile, half swallowed by ivy, with panes fogged by years of condensation and dust. One panel had broken and been patched with wire mesh. Inside, I could make out rows of planters, something green and pale still struggling toward the light. I stepped inside. It was warmer in there than it should have been. Damp. Close. The smell was sweet and faintly spoiled, soil and roots and something else. Something faintly metallic. Plants I didn't recognize twisted in slow arcs toward the ceiling. Their leaves were translucent, vein darkened like skin held to the sun. Some of them had labels. Most did not. There were no tools, no gardening gloves, no watering can. Only rows of life that hadn't stopped growing, despite the years. At the back was a single chair. Wooden, worn smooth. Facing the plants. As if someone had spent hours there. Watching. Not tending. Just watching. I didn't sit. I didn't want to. Instead, I wandered the edge of the property, finding old paths that led nowhere. A rusted gate that didn't open. A well that had been boarded shut long ago, the planks gone soft with age. I felt the house behind me, watching through the windows, not with malice, but with that same weight of attention. Like it was trying to remember what I used to be. Or maybe it already knew. That evening, as I stood at the window of my room, I saw something move by the tree line. A person, or the memory of one. They didn't step forward, didn't wave. Just stood there, half behind a birch tree, barely visible. Pale, thin, too still. I stared until the sky went dark and the shape was swallowed by shadow. That night, I dreamt of a hallway with no end, and a voice behind me that never spoke above a whisper. The next morning, the footprints were still there. Not mine. Smaller. Bare. They trailed across the kitchen tile, damp ovals like a child had walked in from the garden after rain. Only it hadn't rained. The ground outside was dry and cracked, the sky unbroken, and I had locked the doors. I stood for a long while beside the sink, watching the trail. It didn't go far, just across the room, then stopped, as if whoever had made them had simply disappeared. I didn't clean them. Something about the prints felt borrowed, as if removing them would invite something worse. A silence I hadn't earned. I made tea instead. I told myself again, as I would many times, that old houses shift, breathe, echo, that they remember too much and sometimes speak. But the kettle boiled without hissing. The day passed slow, like syrup moving down glass. I kept to the lower floors, unwilling to go upstairs unless necessary. The rooms up there, especially the locked one at the end of the hall, felt too still. They were heavier. Their silence different. Less like absence, more like waiting. I had not tried to open that door since the first night, but I passed it every time I walked down the hall, and each time I felt something gather behind it. Not a sound, just presence. A thickening of space. A suggestion. I began to avoid it, even in thought. Instead, I worked my way through the study. My grandfather had kept everything. His handwriting was sharp, sparse. His journals dated back to the 1960s. Most were filled with drawings of plants, sketches, notes, obscure notations in Latin and Greek. He was a man of science, but his work read like scripture, devout and trembling. In the margin of one entry, he had scrawled a single sentence in a shaking hand. The things that grow in silence do not belong to us. I closed the book then, and did not read more. That evening, I walked the path behind the house again. The sun dipped low, bathing everything in honey-colored light. I thought of leaving. I could. I still had my car. The nearest town was a few miles. I told myself I was free, but I did not go. Instead, I paused near the tree line. There, nestled in a hollow beneath the roots, was a small wooden box. Its lid was carved with symbols, no language I knew, just marks, soft from age. Inside, I found a doll, threadbare, homestitched, the kind you might find in an old attic. But its face was mine, or what mine had been as a child. Hair the same pale gold, eyes mismatched, like mine after the accident. One green, one blue. Its limbs stiff, tied with red string. I did not touch it. I closed the box. The wind picked up then, sharp and sudden. The trees sighed, and for a moment I heard laughter, faint, high, and familiar, drifting through the leaves. A laugh I hadn't heard since I was 7. I slept little after that. Nights in the house deepened. It no longer felt empty, it felt occupied. Not with people, not even with presences. With memory. Dense, heavy, layered like damp paper. One night, I dreamed of the locked room. The door stood open, swaying slightly. A light pulsed inside, not warm, not cold, just wrong. In the dream, I walked toward it barefoot, my steps making no sound on the wooden floor. When I reached the threshold, something behind me whispered my name, but I didn't turn around. Inside the room, the wallpaper had peeled, revealing thousands of fingerprints pressed into the wood beneath. Tiny ones. Children's. They moved when I blinked. I woke up with my face turned toward the hallway. The door at the end was closed, but the air smelled faintly of lilacs. Lilacs. My sister's favorite. I hadn't thought of her in years. Truly thought of her. I mean, of her hands, the way she walked slightly on tiptoe, how she always whispered to the corners of rooms like she expected them to whisper back. I was 9 when she vanished. We had been playing in our grandmother's garden. She was there one moment, crouched beneath the hedge, whispering to a beetle, and then she wasn't. There had been no struggle, no sound, no trace. They searched for days. But I remember something no one else ever knew. The day before she disappeared, she said, "The roots under the house don't sleep." I had laughed. She hadn't. Now I sat alone in my grandfather's house, his house with the garden that grew without light, and her words returned like breath on a mirror. That morning, I opened the locked door. I didn't look for a key. I simply turned the handle and it gave way. The room was not dusty. It was clean, preserved. A child's room. Faded toys. Books with corners curled. A rocking horse stilled midsway. And on the far wall, a mirror. but it did not reflect me. The room in the glass was not the room I stood in. It was older, hung with moss. The window in the reflection showed no garden, only a dark field with no end, where figures stood facing away, unmoving. In the center of the reflection, a girl. Small, blonde, barefoot. She raised her head slowly. Her eyes were mine. Her mouth opened. And then, the mirror cracked, not from side to side, but outward, as if from pressure on the other side. I closed the door, locked it, left the house 2 days later. But sometimes, when night comes quiet and slow, I smell lilacs. Sometimes I find small, damp footprints in my apartment hallway, leading to a door that doesn't exist. And every now and then, only when I forget to leave a light on, I see the mirror in dreams again. Cracked, bleeding darkness, and her reflection waiting, just behind mine.